Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thanks also to everyone who helped bring me here, including Dr. Renee Stahl and all the names that you had mentioned in your introduction. The image of the brainwashed zealot is one we're likely all familiar with. Since the early 1990s, for instance, we've heard about them in news stories of young people who joined Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other jihadist organizations. More recently, news reports have described young white men, radicalized, sometimes described as brainwashed, via social media into white nationalist organizations. The brainwashed convert is a particularly problematic figure in American public life. Choosing one's faith, however distasteful to one's relatives or unfamiliar among one's community, is a long cherished American right. The freedom to belong to the faith of one's choosing is, after all, enshrined in our founding principles. But this idea of the brainwashed convert has a distinctive history. I am especially intrigued by the way the image of the brainwashed religious convert emerged in the decades after World War II. These were decades, of course, when the public celebration of religion's role in sustaining American democracy reached something like a fever pitch. In making the case for the United States' supremacy in a global Cold War, American policy leaders and politicians argued that a so-called Judeo-Christian foundation of American democracy was essential to its strength and intrinsic to its moral authority. And I just want to pause and say it's really an extraordinary honor and opportunity to talk on subjects for which so many members of this university are also experts, including the Judeo-Christian, the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition with Ramit over there. National leaders defended the freedom of conscience as a crucial aspect of the war against global communism. At stake was God-loving American democracy versus a faithless communist threat. News reports described Protestant missionaries and Catholic priests imprisoned in China and in Eastern Europe for practicing their faith. Religion served as a supporting rationale for military intervention abroad. There were, of course, several overt displays of this celebration of faith. In the 1950s, "In God We Trust" was added to the US currency. "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. National prayer breakfasts began, organized by a zealously Christian organization that gathered business titans, US presidents, and members of Congress and policy leaders to piously celebrate the faiths that they believed sustained the values at the heart of American democracy. Arguments for religion's role in sustaining democracy, however, flourished alongside an equally potent fear of false beliefs. Evidence of Manchurian candidates, such as a group of American POWs who refused repatriation from North Korea in the 1950s, provoked panic about the weakness of American minds. The word brainwashing was initially coined to describe victims of political indoctrination, and it entered the vernacular in the United States in the early 1950s. Social scientists of the time likewise observed a troubling loss of individuality under the pressures of mass culture. Were there fakes, phonies, or imposters in our midst? Had a person truly transformed into something new? Were they passing? Were they brainwashed? Brainwashing was understood as a process that would result in a false confession from someone who had surrendered their free will, all to magnify the authority of a charismatic but corrupt leader or organization. What did it mean then to describe certain religious converts as victims of brainwashing? And what did the allegation have to do with race and democracy? That question is one that animates my new book, Public Confessions: The Religious Conversions That Changed American Politics. In the book, I show that controversial religious conversions were big news in the decades after World War II, and that they shaped American politics. These religious conversions form an essential but previously mostly overlooked aspect of the religious revival of the early Cold War. If communism was a kind of mind control, then the freedom of conscience to choose one's religion was fundamental to democracy. But even more than that, these conversions helped expose the way that race and sexuality structured the very meaning of democratic freedom, who belonged and who did not, through critiques of certain conversions as coerced or insincere, and of others as authentic. The authentic convert became a representative of not only a particular faith, but an image of the free individual, one that encompassed most often heterosexual and white privilege. The victim of brainwashing, by contrast, was a pathetic, gullible figure under someone else's control. Public Confessions argues that controversial religious conversions made religious authenticity more important to American politics. This occurred because these conversions instigated conversations about the ways in which certain religions could or could not uphold democracy. These conversions were important in part because each one challenged presumptions about what was normal, so-called, in American life. Religious conversion in the post-war United States thus meant far more than a choice of faith. At a time of unprecedented investment in the idea of the religious foundations of American democracy and capitalism, religion offered a vernacular language for conversations about sex, race, authenticity, and selfhood. My talk this afternoon situates Muhammad Ali's religious journey among a cohort of culturally and politically significant conversions of the post-World War II era. I believe him to be the first prominent religious convert in the United States to be described as brainwashed. The allegation was significant not only for what it said about the faith he joined, the Nation of Islam, but for the way it intersected with the specific debates over democratic freedom, political authenticity, and racial justice in the mid-20th century United States. In 1964, the accusation that other people controlled Ali's thoughts found purchase. It combined widespread fears of masked mind control, antagonism toward the Nation of Islam in particular, and skepticism about a Black American man's power of self-creation. Throughout all of it, Muhammad Ali asserted his freedom to define his identity. Allegations of brainwashing in the 1960s echoed a long-standing strategy of accusing unorthodox religious leaders of duping their followers by stealing their powers of thought. In the 19th century United States, the Protestant majority viewed the growing population of American Catholics as a direct threat to their political and cultural power. And in many such instances, their vitriol focused on perceptions of gender disorder and sexual immorality among practitioners of the minority faith. Anti-Catholic leaders described nuns as deviants who seduced innocent Protestant women into joining their ranks, and often described Catholic priests as charismatic seducers. Anti-Mormon literature of the time portrayed the women who joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as deluded and the men as louche. And interestingly, in the 19th century, these diatribes most often compared these faiths to Islam, with comparing to stereotypical ideas of harems and various exotic rituals, as they were basically misunderstood. So accusations that a convert had been confused, coerced, or brainwashed into belief evoked this history of associating religious deviance with sexual deviance. Yet by the end of the 19th century, Americans had largely accepted that religious identity was a choice rather than an inheritance. Something I talk about more in the book is just how enormously widespread religious conversion is in American history. Brainwashing, when applied to religious choices, created a language of exception to that norm, a way to discredit certain faiths perceived as problematic or dangerous. The precise term brainwashing is relatively new in American vernacular. It was first popularized, as I mentioned, in the early 1950s. 24 American POWs in Korea refused repatriation. Look magazine described the victims as, quote, prisoners of Pavlov, conditioned and tortured until they subordinated themselves to a totalitarian state. As reporters, politicians, and others puzzled over the unrepatriated American prisoners of war, they speculated that African Americans and poor whites would be more susceptible to communist brainwashing, though that turned out not to be representative of the men who chose to stay. Some commentators even admitted that they could understand why Black Americans would find the communist critique of the United States compelling. But importantly, brainwashing functioned here as a way to explain a profound change in political beliefs. The US government defined its strategic interest as halting the spread of communism and committed troops to conflict zones for that purpose. For that reason, a captive serviceman's acquiescence to communist ideology exposed vulnerabilities in the freedom of conscience necessary for American democracy to thrive. Declarations by the unrepatriated American POWs in Korea that, quote, there is no freedom of speech in the United States, end quote, and that they found, quote, real democracy under communism became proof positive that their captors controlled their thinking. There could be no other explanation for why young American men refused to return home to, quote, college on the GI Bill if they want to, or a job in a free country if they do not. There's a quote from one of the critics of them. It was all well and good for ex-communists to become Christian crusaders, which was something happening at the same time quite prominently in the US. But the idea that American Christians might become communist undermined the premises of Cold War anti-communist faith in the US. The premise of brainwashing as a political matter questioned the masculinity of its male victims. The principal victim of brainwashing was described as having an overbearing mother in the extreme. Philip Wiley's momism, if you're familiar with that, come to life. News articles about the unrepatriated POWs depicted them as long-haired homosexuals. A timely book described brainwashing as, quote, the rape of the mind, end quote. These images of emasculated prisoners circulated amid a broader Cold War American panic over endangered masculinity, so-called homosexual infiltration of the government, and weakness in the face of communism's seductive secret agents. Carrying this theme along, The Manchurian Candidate, a popular novel published in 1959 and its 1962 film adaptation, told the fictional story of American Korean War veterans who gradually realized upon their return to the United States that they had been subjected to brutal communist mind control experiments while in captivity in Manchuria. The film's release amid the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and its nomination for several Academy Awards kept brainwashing relevant in American popular culture. Theories abounded to explain what appeared to be masked mind control. Psychologists and other social scientists validated these fears. They produced theories about mass culture's deadening effects on individuality and about the power of authoritarian regimes to silence dissent. Even science fiction and films cast the American family as easy prey for body snatchers. Sociologists, novelists, and social observers produced a trove of books about the risks that mass society posed to authenticity and freedom. A new psychology of identity further studied these questions. Identity, as a term, usefully combined a psychological concept of the personality with a sociological idea of social location or associational life. And it became the dominant way in which Americans named both their individual and their collective personhood. The age knew no finer thinker on the subject of authentic identity, which was authentic identity becomes a huge topic of study and discussion, than the German Jewish emigre scholar Erich Fromm. One of his books, Escape from Freedom, 1941, and just you think about the title, Escaping from Freedom, examined the conditions that produced authoritarian regimes in order to prevent more of them from arising. Escape from Freedom described, quote, the loss of identity, end quote, that led to mass conformity. So a person who willingly allows themselves to go along with an authoritarian has basically given up that individual identity to be part of a collective. Fromm characterized the pursuit of authentic selfhood not as navel-gazing self-indulgence, but as a necessary precondition for the expansion of human freedom. Fromm and other mid-20th century social theorists warned about internalized self-deceptions rather than intentional masquerade. So what they're concerned about is that people really coming to believe the things that they said they believed. And how is it that something that was previously seen as totally abhorrent could become an identity that many people embraced? Brainwashing stayed relevant in the early 1960s thanks to books about Chinese authoritarianism, such as Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, published in 1961 by Robert J. Lifton. Lifton spoke to the fears that animated the social psychology of Fromm. His book was not merely an investigation of the mind's processes, but more grandly and ominously, quote, a psychological study of extremism or totalism, end quote. He explained how authoritarian groups controlled their followers. And these were some of the terms. milieu control, mystical manipulation to convince followers of the group's higher purpose, a demand for moral purity, a so-called cult of confession, a profusion of jargon-laden but definitive sounding phrases, and a prioritization of doctrine over personal well-being. This model of brainwashing contrasted how individuals made ideological decisions under democratic or free conditions versus under authoritarianism. It was nothing if not capacious, particularly when applied to religion. What religion did not do some of these things? Enter Cassius Clay. The February 1964 heavyweight boxing title match between Sonny Liston and Cassius Clay was the biggest news in sports. Clay was a flamboyant upstart, a 22-year-old gold medal winner from the 1960 Olympics in Rome, who had since won most of his fights, while infuriating his opponents with his flippant aphorisms and wild publicity stunts. His opponent in February 1964, Sonny Liston, seemed humorless by contrast. The odds were 8-1 that Liston would defeat Clay when they met in Miami. Many sports fans wondered if Clay would even survive. Liston was that sort of fighter. When the bell rang for the start of the 7th round, however, Sonny Liston did not get up from his stool. He could barely lift his left arm. He had blood draining from a cut under one eye. The referee then declared that Cassius Clay, the graceful, boastful challenger, had won by a technical knockout. And as we all know, the new heavyweight boxing champion raised his gloved fists and shouted, "I'm the greatest." Reporters who had presumed that Liston would knock out Clay in an early round had plenty of good copy to send their editors as it was. The next morning gave those who paid attention a surprise lead. Clay told a room full of reporters gathered for a press conference that he was a believer in Islam, confirming what many had already come to suspect. Answering questions about the sincerity of his beliefs, he retorted, quote, "I know where I'm going, and I know the truth, and I don't have to be what you want me to be. I'm free to be who I want," end quote. Soon after the upset victory, he clarified that he was a follower of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad soon gave him a new name, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali thus expressed his freedom of conscience, his freedom to be who he wanted to be. When Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali, he did not simply proclaim a new religious identity. He also defied a white establishment that felt entitled to curtail his freedom because he was Black. He additionally turned his back on a Black civil rights establishment rooted in African-American churches and the Black press that were appalled by the nation's emphasis on racial separatism and its antipathy to Christianity. Rumors that Ali had been brainwashed were already circulating in the weeks leading up to the match against Liston. Reports suggested that he had been brainwashed by Elijah Muhammad or by the nation's minister, Malcolm X. Those rumors cast doubts on Ali's freedom of conscience and his ability to know himself. His announcement in 1964 that he was a member of the Nation of Islam was thus a bold statement about both his religious and his racial identities. The Nation of Islam that he joined was explicitly opposed to the mainstream civil rights movement's nonviolent approach to racial justice and to that movement's emphasis on racial integration. The nation's fiery orator, Malcolm X, preached against the complacency of Black and white people who trusted the American political system to remedy its own transgressions. Only separation from white people and faith in the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he taught, could save them. The theology of the nation was an eclectic blend of several traditions, incorporating ideas from the Islamic Ahmadiyya movement, whose practitioners could be found in many American cities in the early 20th century, the Moorish Science Temple, a smaller but in northern cities influential movement, and biblical interpretation. Practitioners understood themselves as part of a nation that superseded national borders, belonging to a people with an ancient and proud history, the first people and the first faith. Elijah Muhammad taught that he was the messenger of Wallace D. Fard, who had created the lost found Nation of Islam in the 1930s and claimed to be God himself. Fard did. The nation's racial philosophy, however, was all that most Americans knew about the small and controversial sect. If they had heard about it, they likely understood it to be a hate-filled Black supremacist group intent on killing white people, which they definitely weren't. No report was more influential in this regard than a 1959 television program, The Hate That Hate Produced, a sensationalist documentary, which was narrated by Mike Wallace, the white television journalist. Wallace worked from a white liberal thesis that years of mistreatment explained an explosion of Black hate. He transformed footage of the Nation of Islam into a warning about a Black supremacist movement. The Nation of Islam that Cassius Clay joined in the early 1960s certainly bore the unmistakable imprint of Malcolm X's impassioned demands for racial separation and Black empowerment. Malcolm's orations against white supremacy reached hundreds of thousands of African Americans. In 1963, Newsweek magazine chronicled, quote, the increasingly restless and militant mood of the American Negro. Even the left-wing publications The Nation described Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X as Negro militants committed to, quote, Negro racist nationalism in their desire for distinct African nation apart from the United States. Elijah Muhammad's outreach to Ku Klux Klan leaders who shared his vision of racial separation lent credence to these critiques. The nation's message of Black pride, self-defense, and anti-white protest inspired a teenage Cassius Clay as he struggled through high school in Louisville in the late 1950s. Already training for a career in boxing, he spent evenings in his parents' home listening to a recording of by Louis X called A White Man's Heaven is a Black Man's Hell. Louis X was formerly Lewis Walcott, who, like many followers of the nation, gave up his last name for the letter X, and he later took the last name Farrakhan. So Louis Farrakhan was he gave up a career as a calypso singer when he joined the nation, but his records were one of the key ways of transmitting the ideas of the nation to a broader audience. And I just think it's worth thinking about that because Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, according to his biographers, most likely had some serious learning challenge, possibly dyslexia. So oral material would have been a main way for him to learn. And so listening to records, going and hear people give talks was a big part of how he educated himself. Shortly before he left for the Olympics in 1960, he listened to a minister for the nation preach on a street corner in Harlem. Out one evening with friends in Louisville, he bought a copy of Muhammad Speaks, the nation's newsletter. At his side was his younger brother, Rudy, who followed his brother into boxing, but may have led him into the Nation of Islam. In Miami, where they trained, they met ministers of the nation. They started attending rallies and services at Miami's Temple number 29. Cassius dropped his last name soon when he was among members of the nation, replacing it with an X to mark his rejection of the so-called slave name that his family carried. In 1962, he met Malcolm X at a restaurant in Detroit and introduced himself as a loyal follower of Elijah Muhammad. It's another story, but that meeting was the start of an intense mentoring relationship that lasted until just shortly after the 1964 fight in Miami. Cassius Clay soaked up the nation's racial philosophy. He explained to reporters that his faith taught peace and love while refusing to adapt to US racial inequalities. He answered reporters' questions about the civil rights movement with answers he learned through intensive study of the nation's doctrine. He declared that the Nation of Islam was the group that defended and protected the rights of the Black man. He told reporters that he attended a Nation of Islam rally for political reasons. Quote, I'm a race man, and every time I go to a Muslim meeting, I get inspired, end quote. I think his statements about African-American rights echoed what he may have heard from Malcolm X, who quite similarly told the journalist Alex Haley in a May 1963 interview, quote, a Muslim is somebody who is for the Black man. Intelligent Black men today are interested in a religious doctrine that offers a solution to their problems right now, right here on earth, while they are alive. It's worth noting, I think, that the nation's patriarchal ethos appealed to Cassius Clay as well. Expectations for masculine strength and leadership within the Nation of Islam likely shaped his desire to convert. and Clay would have agreed with Elijah Muhammad that dignified Black manhood required women's docility and subordination. This is the subject that Berkeley scholar Eula Taylor is the expert on, and I've been very convinced by her work of the way that the stereotypes of Black women that circulated in white American culture were part of what made the nation's patriarchal philosophy appealing to a lot of the men and women who joined it, where there was a presumption of Black women's sexual respectability and protection by Black men who would be the leaders within the household. Muhammad Ali never hesitated to credit the nation's theology of Black racial destiny and message of peace as drawing him to the faith, but few of his Christian critics took that explanation seriously. Instead, they equated serious interest in the Nation of Islam with a weak sense of self. A sports reporter for the Los Angeles Times described Clay's, now I'm going to quote some very racist things that reporters said about him, described Clay as, quote, very impressionable, as the Black Muslim thing points out. Noting his youth, he was just 22 years old in February 1964, and also because of his personality and his race. Clay's reputation for performative self-regard amplified these impressions of him. American magazines and newspapers portrayed him as a loudmouth braggart. Rumors circulated by late 1963 that Cassius and Rudy Clay had joined the nation. Reporters cited them at rallies and exiting temples. But the first accusation of brainwashing, in particular, came from their father. In early February 1964, about 2 weeks before the Liston fight, Cassius Clay Sr., a 51-year-old sign painter, described his son as a weak-willed victim of the nation's information campaigns. He said that the leaders of the nation had been indoctrinating his sons for years, quote, hammering him and brainwashing him, end quote. Described by biographers as a tough and even cruel parent, Clay Sr. insulted his son's intelligence. Quote, the nation's leaders deal only with the ignorant colored people, end quote. He laid most of the blame at the feet of Elijah Muhammad, saying that he practiced a nefarious form of mind control. Quote, all these Muslims worship one man, Muhammad. He hypnotizes them so they can't think. All the words that come out of their mouths are his words. He completely dominates them. They might as well be in prison, end quote. The association between brainwashing and imprisonment or captivity reflected the era's worst fears about the co-optation of American minds, the antithesis of freedom. As a side note, by January 1963, the film version of The Manchurian Candidate was playing on screens in Kentucky. It's possible that Cassius Sr. saw the movie or read about it, or just heard it discussed among friends and clients. But he need not have. American culture was awash in fears of coercion by then. The popular young adult novel, A Wrinkle in Time, featured a perilous journey to the planet Camazotz, which was itself a play on the Kennedy administration's Camelot, where a disembodied brain dictated the thoughts and actions of the inhabitants, whose identical suburban homes and anonymous office towers represented the terrifying apotheosis of post-war conformity. Brainwashing in this context represented a stealth tactic of America's ideological enemies to weaken the nation from within. That was an insight that came through that one of the rare moments when parenting aided my scholarship. Reporters seized on the possibility that Ali had been brainwashed by the mysterious Black Muslims. Cornered in Miami in early February 1964, Ali refused to take the bait. Quote, I don't care what my father said. I'm not interested and I'm not talking. Headline writers forged ahead. Brainwashing, blazed the Washington Post. His insistence on his right to define his faith against the expectations of everyone except himself and his God startled a boxing establishment that consigned African-American prize fighters to very limited stereotypes, either the cooperative, unthreatening integrationist like Joe Louis or Floyd Patterson, or this image of the brute beast like Sonny Liston. Rather than indicating independent thought or spiritual self-determination, Clay's conversion within that context became indicative of the susceptibility of Black men to the nation's controversial message, at once indicating weakness and threat. If even the strongest of Black American men was too weak to resist Black Muslim rhetoric, white Americans had reason to fear the Black men under Elijah Muhammad's control, men who denounced whites and advocated racial separation. To these critics, brainwashing offered the only plausible explanation for the nation's growing popularity or for its successful recruitment of Cassius Clay. This is somewhat more speculative, but I think Muhammad Ali was additionally susceptible to brainwashing accusations for the myriad ways in which he ignored normative gender roles. Although he was handsome and physically impressive, Ali preferred to call himself pretty, which in 1964 was not a word that men used to describe themselves in a normative heterosexual context. Because of his faith, he did not drink, smoke, or attend wild parties. As David Remnick notes in his biography of Ali, early in the boxer's career, many sports writers speculated that Ali was gay. A faithful Muslim, Ali initially avoided heterosexual promiscuity. It would not take long for him to more than make up for his youthful purity. And by the late 1960s, during his first marriage, he had a whole lot of sex outside of his marriage, as far as we know, all with women. But in the context of the Cold War, queerness suggested a susceptibility to blackmail and a threat to national security. This was part of the justification for firing gay men and lesbians, people suspected of being gay or lesbian, from the federal government, that they were a security threat. So this was already this image of an untrustworthy character who invited suspicion of his sincerity. Rumors of his queerness were shrouded in the racial denigration of a proudly Black man. Here was a Black man taking up space and refusing to apologize. White and Black journalists wanted to take him down a peg. Muhammad Ali had learned from Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, meanwhile, that white people had been brainwashing Black people and themselves for millennia, and that the nation offered their only hope of intellectual and spiritual autonomy. This is an argument that James Baldwin also made, that whiteness is basically the result of brainwashing. White supremacy is the result of brainwashing. And there's a video you can find of Muhammad Ali saying, "Look, everywhere I look, everyone in commercials is white. You know, everywhere I look, all the actors on the screen are white. All the teachers, you look around, the whole world is white." That's brainwashing. I've been taught that if I have value, I would be white. And that is brainwashing. So he's describing it as a systemic process, not something that happens at the individual level. And I think that that's something he learned through his conversations with Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad and other leaders in the Nation of Islam. So for followers of Elijah Muhammad, theirs too was a gendered narrative of resisting mind control. Unlike civil rights integrationists, the nation's men were free of white society's control, their minds and bodies independently defying white supremacist domination of their masculine birthright. They were the truly independent-minded men, in contrast to the white men and integrationist Black men. I'm going to skip through some of the more racist criticism of him. The criticism of him intensified after he failed his Army induction tests several times. He was booed when he showed up at fights and asked to be introduced as Muhammad Ali. And by the end of March 1964, he had been suspended from the World Boxing Association for, quote, conduct detrimental to the best interests of boxing. His conversion set the course for the whole rest of his career. And when the Army revised his draft status to 1A in 1966, he was called up, he refuses, claims a religious exemption, has his title stripped, and gets embroiled in a legal battle that lasts years, in which he is eventually victorious. But he becomes a lecturer along the way at representing the Nation of Islam. Muhammad Ali's conversion and the allegations of brainwashing used against him also set the stage for the response to the cult scare that followed soon after. In the 1960s and 1970s, these so-called cults seemed to feed upon youthful innocence and end in bloodshed. News reports described the murderous rampages of the Manson gang in 1969, Patricia Hearst's kidnapping and claims of brainwashing or Stockholm syndrome, the Jonestown massacre in 1978, or drinking the Kool-Aid, and sexual abuses carried out by members of the Children of God, among many other new religious movements. Scholars of religion describe new religious movements and that other people would call cults. It's a word that is not used respectfully and is thus not used by scholars who study it. Neither is brainwashing by people who study how people come to have the beliefs that they have. These were important because at the time, evangelical Protestantism, as a sort of more fundamentalist version, was still quite marginal in American public life and was seeking to get new legitimacy. Many observers couldn't tell the difference in a sense. They looked at mass conversions in the Pacific Ocean, and they looked at mass gatherings of Hare Krishna, and they said, well, these are the same thing, right? These are part of this, all these lost youths joining some sort of charismatic faith, being brainwashed, as they would say. And so organized groups of evangelical Protestants said, well, absolutely not. We're authentic. We have real beliefs. We're American. That other stuff is nonsense, and began to profile and literally put on the stage, put on the cover of magazines, surprising religious converts, people who had led sort of dissolute or criminal lives, who had then become born again and become figures of American Protestantism as a way to make the case. Even when Jimmy Carter campaigned in 1976, some of his aides among themselves talked about his faith as, quote, the weirdo factor, that they were worried would turn off a lot of American voters. So among those evangelicals, it's just a fun Berkeley side note, among the evangelicals who was paraded as a surprising convert was Eldridge Cleaver. The cancellation of whose class here in 1968 prompted students to demonstrate and occupy offices in this building. But by 1976, after years in exile and returning for a prison term, he was born again in prison, he said, and became a poster child for this new form of evangelical Protestantism. So to conclude, I have the difficulty in concluding this talk that I had in concluding my book, which had multiple conclusions written, which is that there are so many pieces, and I think we could take them in a lot of different directions. Here's one. Radical Islam, so-called, emerged as a new existential threat to American democracy at the end of the Cold War, replacing communism as the antithesis of sincere faith. And I mean that, not that it actually did, but in political rhetoric it did, and in policy. Racist presumptions about Muslims heightened these contrasts between so-called Christian democracy and its challengers. Just as many Americans once confused Stalinist dictatorship with socialism, so media coverage and political analysis surrounding Islamic fundamentalism tended to equate Muslim faith with violence. Though absent of historical truth or theological complexity, the so-called contrast between Islam and the West shaped both public opinion and political decision-making about the war on terror. It revived assumptions about associations between a narrow set of religious views and American values. Racism, of course, suffused Islamophobia, linking dark-skinned otherness to a politics of violence. And the contrast to white Christian men's terrorist attacks on US soil is stark. Neither the bombing of the Alfred Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City in 1965 by Timothy McVeigh, a Roman Catholic, nor repeated violent assaults against abortion providers by members of the Christian group Operation Rescue provoked any outcries about radical Christianity or Christianity's dissonance with Western values. The religious and political meanings of brainwashing have sustained its relevance as a way to explain religious choices that are not only unusual, but that seem to threaten American democracy. But parents in the last, I've seen sort of my initial understanding of this is that in the last 20, 25 years or so, we see these allegations of brainwashing invoked by parents, not to insult or ostracize their children as Cassius Clay Sr. did, but to exonerate them. John Walker Lind became known as the American Taliban after American forces discovered him among al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. His mother, Marilyn Walker, explained why he changed after he left her home in California to work for a humanitarian aid group in Pakistan. Quote, if he got involved in the Taliban, he must have been brainwashed, she said. When you're young and impressionable, it's easy to be led by charismatic people, end quote. Similarly, the father of British-born Richard Reed, the shoe bomber who attempted to detonate a bomb on a US-bound passenger jet in December 2001, said that brainwashing alone explained why his son would do that. The DC sniper's defense included assertions that he had been brainwashed. And we see this also in an FBI investigation of Somali American men in the Twin Cities. Brainwashing was used. In 2019, the parents of a US-born woman named Hoda Mutana, who had joined ISIS and wanted to come back to the United States for a whole legal case presented by the parents, and has simply only recently been resolved at the level of the Supreme Court. A big part of their defense was that she had been brainwashed while she was in Syria. The Cold War US faith in democracy was problematic from the start. Many historians show how the term Judeo-Christian could both signal an exclusionary sort of ecumenism, but also privilege Christianity above other faiths. Brainwashing became a useful way to distinguish among the real and the fake, not as observations of reality, but as constructions of difference. Muhammad Ali's counter-argument that whiteness was a pervasive structural form of brainwashing resonates today as the US grapples with overt white Christian nationalism. Part of this concerns the radicalization of young white men and women who see their faith as the faith for the United States. But Ali's critique would have turned our focus away from the persuasive tactics used on impressionable young people to take in the long arc of human history and the illusion of white supremacy that it produced. Thank you.
Thank you. That was such a fascinating talk. I'm curious if you're familiar with the case of the Maharishi Mahesh and Mia Farrow and the Beatles, and because during that time, this is also in the 60s, and when they went to India, there was also this. They thought that she had been brainwashed, and it's interesting because it was very different from the way they talked about brainwashing of Muhammad Ali, because it was more of this brainwashing to exonerate her.
Yes.
Right. And so I'm curious, just if you could talk about that, and like in what instances brainwashing is an accusation, as it is to condemn or to say that someone is, as a condemnation, as in the case of Muhammad Ali, versus using brainwashing as to exonerate them from blame, right? Mm-hmm. And here is, of course, Mia Farrow, who's this lovely young white woman, right? And, mm-hmm. and yeah, so if you can talk about that too.
Sure, and that's a great example, and it's similar to in Patricia Hearst's defense. It was also, right, yeah. She seemed to be totally on board with what she was doing when she was involved in the violent efforts of the SLA, but then her defense was that she had Stockholm syndrome. Yes, so I think that the answer has to do with politics, mm-hmm. and I think that it is a very politically, because of the way that religion and this idea of freedom of conscience is so problematically, I think, intertwined with how we think about what democracy is and what freedom means, that brainwashing can be used to try to pull the rug out from under political ideas that other people want to sideline and discredit. And so that's where I think that it has, and that's where I think that Muhammad Ali is such a pivotal figure, because both because he was a politically engaged person, but also because the Nation of Islam was such a politically as well as religiously controversial group. So it was kind of a perfect matchup there. So that's what and yes, white people are very often described as sort of brain, especially young women, as, so women are supposed to be susceptible according to gender stereotypes and sexual stereotypes, that, the women are sort of passive and that they're more like an empty vessel, just waiting for ideas to come in and fill their heads, which was also, so that's far more likely to be seen as sort of and it goes back to the 19th century, thinking about women who became members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or women who converted to Catholicism. There was this fear that these were good people, moral people, not bad people, not dangerous people, but people whose brains were so weak that they were easily coerced into something evil.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I thought that was so interesting, and I think my question kind of follows up on Carolyn's question. So I am actually writing my dissertation about the cult scare and about like parents and kids and politics and stuff like that. So I was super, super interested in this, especially the last chapter of your book. And one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking, sort of to Carolyn's question, was that like a really interesting shift, I think, is from that kind of 50s, like, maybe people of color are more susceptible, maybe effete men, effeminate men, right? Like if you're a strong kind of hardy American person, you're not. And something happens, I think, because after Jonestown, there's so much debate about this. And one of the things, first of all, people are more concerned about white kids, right? By then, they're considered like white teens and college students. And you see these crazy quotes of people being like, well, Black and brown kids are street smart, so it's not going to happen to them. It's the white college kids from the suburbs you have to worry about, which seems like such a reversal. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that, and then also sort of changes in the psychological profession, because I think that there's something that happens where one of the things that scares people about cults so much is that it can happen to anybody at the same time, right? You have this Zimbardo experiment, right? Like anybody in the right conditions can become this way. It has actually kind of little to do with privilege and all this stuff. So I just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on what you think happens. I mean, the obvious thing would be like the counterculture and protests. People are worried about college students, and so they're the ones susceptible. But if you have any thoughts on sort of what changes from that 50s moment and that early 60s moment to where it's, oh no, this is everywhere, it's everybody, and especially white kids.
So, and I've been asked to sort of summarize questions for people watching the live stream who can't always hear from the audience.
That was a long one.
This is a question from an expert in the cult scares who is writing a dissertation on the cult scares, and asking sort of what happens that by the 1980s, the concern is more about suburban white kids, middle class white people, and this idea that maybe anybody is susceptible to being indoctrinated or to joining a cult. And whereas African-American kids are stereotyped as being more street smart and therefore less susceptible to brainwashing. I know that I didn't capture all of your detailed question. I'm returning to politics. I think that what you're describing is a question about psychology and a question about religion. And I think that what was then in place by the 1980s is a much more coherent religious right that was more confident in its authority and was making a different set of arguments about its legitimacy in American politics. And that was no longer dealing with criticisms that it was just another cult, so-called, right? That its legitimacy was firmly established through its massive public relations networks and institutions. But I also, another part of, and I don't know if this is coming up in your research or not, but another part of what's shifting in that same time period is this greater criticism of white middle class women who are increasingly joining the paid workforce after they have children or not leaving at all. So these are children now who are improperly mothered because there isn't someone there to protect them after school, as mothers are supposed to be, according to this. And so therefore this whole new set of youth, that's who we should be worrying about. In some ways, it's part of the sort of cultural conservative turn, it sounds like to me, in the 1980s, of shifting concern away from people who are living at society's margins, who are impoverished, who are lacking resources, and this intensification of focus on the psychology of fairly privileged people, relatively speaking. That'd be my initial guess. But I look forward to reading your work so that I'll really know the answer to that question.
So,
I was really struck by the one line I think was given by Ali's father when he says, "These people are just beholden to one man, Muhammad." And it struck me because at first, when I heard that, it sounded like kind of centuries old stereotype about Islam, which is that it's authoritarian and the kind of like, deformed form of monotheism. But on the other hand, taken about Elijah Muhammad, it sounds like a critique of a new religious movement. And I guess that led me to wonder in the commentary and in the kind of the criticisms of Muhammad Ali and the conversion, does it sound like people are recognizing this as an authentic form of Islam that poses the problems that Islam has always posed, or does it seem like something new and kind of heterodox?
So this question is asking in the way that Cassius Sr. criticized his son, saying that Muhammad's just been hammering him about these ideas. Is this in a line of long-standing criticisms of Muslims of just being sort of blind followers of Muhammad, or is this specific to a sort of seeing the Nation of Islam as this new group? The vast majority of people who were criticizing any of these folks, the nation or its leaders or its followers, had no understanding of its religious ideas. They understood it only in the context of racial separatism and what they've understood as an ideology of Black separatism, Black supremacy. So I don't think for Cassius, so what's interesting is Cassius Sr. had been really interested in Marcus Garvey earlier in his life, who was a charismatic leader of a mass movement of African Americans and others sort of transnationally, right? With an argument about, racial separation or sort of racial Black empowerment through business and through migration. He's, I think, also sort of an unstable person, but so I don't know what he knew about Sunni Islam, for example. But my sense is from him and from the other critiques is that it was really based on fear and stereotypes about the Nation of Islam and just grossly racist caricatures of the Middle East and of Arabs and of Muslims. There's a long quote I didn't read. It's really repellent. It's in the book. It's, making this really racist stereotype about, Muhammad Ali riding a camel now. Maybe he's going to trade in his Cadillac for a camel, and it gets worse from there. That's what they knew about the Nation of Islam. So it's not a theologically nuanced critique at all. And Muhammad Ali himself, in the mid-1970s, leaves the Nation of Islam and becomes, along with one of Elijah Muhammad's sons, who also leaves and begins to work on to study Sunni Islam and practice Sunni Islam. And that's what Muhammad Ali identified with for the whole rest of his life as a Muslim. So he did, but by that point, his whole his boxing career was ending. He was the early evidence of Parkinson's was becoming visible, and so he becomes this sort of like gentle figure, right? He's this sort of his whole sort of image changes in the public eye. So it's not really commented on. It's not described as this sort of dangerous thing that's happening. Has he been brainwashed into Sunni Islam? No, nobody writes about it that way by the mid-1970s.
Question from here. The mass conversion of American evangelicals to the worship of Donald Trump, a decidedly non-Christian person, seems to be a modern example of brainwashing. Comments on that? That comes from a guest named Keith Johnson.
Oh, well, thank you.
Johnston.
So Keith Johnston asks if the interest of evangelicals in the sort of support for Donald Trump is an example, modern contemporary example of brainwashing. I would point Keith toward a marvelous book called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Cobbs-Dumay, where she argues quite compellingly that even white evangelical support for Donald Trump was an entirely logical consequence of decades of militant masculine rhetoric and symbolism within evangelical churches, literature, the way they talked about films and the whole sort of popular culture of white evangelicalism had laid the groundwork for support of a person like Donald Trump, not because of his theology at all. I don't think he really has one, but because of his sort of, she talks about how the sort of militant interest in guns and the Western and camo among men who've never served in the military at all. And this sort of masculine militancy that worships the military and the military hero without actually having participated in it at all. And Trump fits that mold as well. Again, I mean, people, the counter argument to brainwashing is that all of us come to believe things over periods of time through various ways. And there are certain beliefs some of us might find abhorrent, right? Dangerous, wrong. But I don't know how useful it is to describe the people who have those beliefs as having been brainwashed, when in fact they might be making a very rational set of decisions based on things they've been learning over a very long period of time that they find very convincing. So that's my response.
Thank you for this great talk. And I guess actually to follow up on this question, I was thinking as you were speaking about how there are kind of two interesting axes on which religion is assessed. One that comes up, especially in the 1960s, as you know, is this question of sort of sincerity, right? Of like, which comes up both in the draft cases as well as just in sort of the legal tests that are being created around free exercise rights. Is someone a sincere believer? And over time, that actually gets like legally diminished because it's just sort of accepted that if someone makes a claim that they're sincere about it, but there's sort of a sincere versus fake, or like, depth of conviction versus like shallow conviction question. And then at the same time, there's, on this question of conversion, there's sort of this like sort of notion of like, again, like the fervent believer or the kind of brainwashed believer. And I'm curious if it just made me wonder, like, how we can think about these axes. Are they intersecting? Are they parallel? Like, what's happening religiously, politically, legally, that these both, sometimes are kind of considered totally separate analytically and sometimes merge. And I guess on top of that, and this is really where the follow-up, perhaps the last question comes, I was thinking about like whether in this particular moment in which we're living, when people describe people who are often white evangelicals, but particularly around their vaccination beliefs, about whether they've been brainwashed, if it's a disinformation campaign, or if it's like some sort of like sincere religious beliefs that they're actually proffering when they're proposing kind of anti-vax religious stances. So I know that's a lot, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
So the question from Ronique Stahl is that there are these two axes for thinking about religion, the sincere versus the fake, and then the sort of fervent or the brainwashed believer. I think they're sort of overlapping, and that what I might think this would help explain about white evangelical anti-vaxxers and whether they have been brainwashed to reject vaccination. So, and this also, I mean, this comes up too, I don't really know. I mean, to the first part of your question, what I can say is that there were two different maybe three different kinds of main concerns. One in this Cold War period that I'm studying, there was a concern about people who were pretending to be something they weren't. So spies, people, subversive people infiltrating groups, disguising their real selves. Then there was the fear of people who were brainwashed, right? Who really thought they were speaking truth, but their thoughts were not their own. So it was sort of internally, one person is a threat to the nation. The other person, like the infiltration has happened at the level of their own brain or their own souls. And then the third was the sort of sociological concern about mass conformity, that everybody was just being like everybody else and individuality writ large had fallen apart. And all of those concerns are happening in these mid-20th century decades at a time when the political message is that, no, what's going to defend us against communism and what makes us superior to communism is freedom. And yet they have all these different circulating fears about how that could be undermined. I didn't answer your question, but I told you what I do know. So I do think that there is something in this idea of radicalization, right? That people can start believing one thing and then be convinced of increasingly more extreme versions of that. I don't know, was graduate school a radicalizing experience? I went in, a left of center, I came out, left of left of left, I don't know. I do think there's something to be said about radicalizing experiences. And we see this with white Christian nationalism and things like Reddit and other social media channels that introduce ideas that people might never have encountered before. These YouTubers who draw people in. We know now that the algorithms of these software is designed to show increasingly more extreme versions of whatever you've searched for. I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, having encountered some of these people at school board meetings, they're certainly sincere, but no, I just don't find brainwashing helpful to think about it, because they are, I think it shows the failures of public health education and our failure to fund public health over the last, it's not a problem of the last 2 years. It's a problem of the last 60 years of, defunding public services. The county I live in at the start of the pandemic did not even have have a public health department. It's a county of over 500,000 people. So how are you going to there's no one to go into the schools to educate people about a sort of communal response to contagion. So I think that that's the context in which I understand these folks, that they know nothing. They know absolutely nothing about epidemiology, about public health. Someone tells them this is how it works, and that's what they have to go on. And that's, is it their fault? We have a broader problem of people not having any concept of how these things work.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask, so in terms of as you were talking about the things that are associated, the traits that are associated with being susceptible to being brainwashed, and how that intersects with anti-Blackness and anti-queerness. To what degree, maybe your last answer got into this a little bit, but to what degree does either ideas about poverty or lack of access to education also become, or is it one of these traits that's it makes you inherently susceptible? I think about, if in the 19th century, so much of the anti-Catholic, fear of anti-Catholic control has to do with being in a position where you either are poor or do not have access to education, and then that's what makes you, susceptible to being in the service of these nefarious influences. So is that a 20th century story? And does that intersect with either anti-Black racism, or is it kind of its own thing?
It's a wonderful question about whether sort of class bias, socioeconomic bias about people who live in poverty or have less access to education, how that might fit into the explanations for who ends up being susceptible to brainwashing. So in the case of the Nation of Islam, it was absolutely true that, so as a sort of statement about the condition of life in the mid-20th century for most African Americans, disproportionately living below the poverty line, disproportionately living in overcrowded housing due to, you know, systemic racism and inequality. So that was one of the fears of the Nation of Islam, that they were putting out a message that people who lived under those circumstances would find appealing. Remember when they thought, well, gosh, it would almost make sense if communists captured African Americans, that they might actually really agree. There's sort of this acknowledgement that the United States has failed African Americans, and so therefore the language and the promises of democracy and freedom wouldn't hold quite as much water for them potentially. Now, obviously, there have been no greater activists for American democracy over the centuries than African Americans leading the civil rights movement and many other things. So that's a fallacy. But so yeah, so the sort of poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage was part of that. It's a fascinating question that I don't know the answer to about what's happening right now. A lot of what we're seeing happen is coming out of middle-class communities, a lot of the anti-vax stuff, a lot of the anti-trans activism. It's another area where people say that young people are being brainwashed, right, into thinking that gender is a construct and thinking that, you know, that they themselves might be transgender. That's sort of a that language. These are vulnerable young people, and people like me fill young people's minds with false ideas about the social constructions of gender and sexuality, and you know, so on. So I don't know more about the sort of class dynamics of that today, though. It's a great question.
I had a short question, wondering to what extent, if any, we might consider brainwashing to be the kind of liberal reaction to the Marxist notion of false consciousness, and whether that holds any water at all.
So, question of whether brainwashing is the liberal version of Marxist false consciousness.
Something like
Did I get that right? Okay. I haven't thought of it that way before. I mean, it's obvious, it's sort of, it's a wonderfully obvious question. What's interesting about the Marxist idea is that it's about systems and structures, whereas brainwashing is really about an individual, not as Ali uses it, but brainwashing as it's used by social scientists and politicians and critics of these groups is really about a susceptible individual who has that sort of, so in some ways that is maybe a more liberal idea, right? That we are these little individual units who are then subject to various ideologies. So yes, I think that works.
You use the phrase anti-communist faith. I think it's sort of interesting thinking of communism as such a broad and strong idea. What kind of differentiates the rhetoric of people who are walking back conversions from actual faiths to conversions to communism?
So the question is for people who converted to communism, is that your question?
If they're going back and defending that decision,
okay.
In what ways is that defense different from the defense that's like an actual faith?
Okay, and how is that different from the defense of an actual faith? So by the 1930s and 40s, there are a number of writers in Europe and the UK and in the US who are describing communism as a religion and the people who sign up for it as converts to that religion. So you have then a series of people who leave communism and write these, you know, torrid memoirs about their seduction and how they came away from that belief. And they write about it as a religion. It was sort of the standard model for how to think about what communism was, that it's totalizing, right? That it has a set of beliefs that you just have to agree to in order to participate in it. So the analogy is made pretty carefully that it's quite similar, that to become a communist is like to become a Roman Catholic, in the sense of how much you have to change the way you think about things and accept a set of beliefs and practices. Then there are also a bunch of folks who by the 40s and early 50s are not only writing about how they first became communists, then how they left it, but how they also found God. And that the finding of God is really the thing that helps them see the errors of communism, that these two things are utterly incompatible. And as I talk about this in the book a little bit, that many of them also write how they explicitly became super heterosexual as they became Christian and as they left communism. They sort of signal their heterosexuality in very overt ways, even those who weren't. So it's this idea about becoming a whole new person. And they compare them pretty closely, that both converting to communism and converting to Christianity of some kinds, let's say, are quite parallel experiences.
Yeah, I have a question, which is, I keep on coming back to the question that the guy asked, that one of the persons in the Zoom audience asked about, Donald Trump, and I'm just wondering, like, is brainwashing in politics something that we only see? Are you making an argument that this is something that that people are using this sort of narrative of brainwashing in the late 20th century, or is it something that we also, because I feel like there are echoes of that today when we talk about misinformation and fake news, which is that the idea is that democracy is still working and it's still intact. It's just that the problem is that you're not really, you're being, I don't know, brainwashed, because we don't use the language of brainwash, but we are still all rational beings and free beings, right? And can think independently. It's just that we're not being fed the right information, right? So it still leaves intact the idea of a democracy, and that individuals and citizens in a democracy can freely choose, and they have that capacity, right? It doesn't undermine democracy, but then it blames instead this other thing called fake news, and that if only people had the right news, the right information, then they would make the right rational decisions and not vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever, right?
Right.
So I'm just wondering, is what we're seeing now the legacy of some of that brainwashing rhetoric in the late 20th century, or is this a new thing that we shouldn't call brainwashing at all? And it's, I don't know what we should call it, but yeah, I'm just wondering.
I hope the microphone picked that up, because it's, I think it's sort of perfect. So the question from Dr. Chen is, is the conversation today around fake news and misinformation, this idea that we're generally all still rational and free beings in a democracy. It's just that other people are getting the wrong information, that what they're hearing is fake news. And if you heard the right information, you would make a better choice according to whoever's saying that. And is this the legacy of the brainwashing rhetoric I write about? I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know how to approach that question, because what I think we've seen is both the erosion of democracy. So this notion of that we are consuming all these ideas in a democratic society is something that we really need to worry about, in part because of the degree to which misinformation is circulated through these exclusive news channels and social media. That's not my own research, right? That's, front page of the newspaper. I think, though, there's something too about religion. And I'm struck by the way that one of the useful critiques of my book is that I don't at the end talk at all about how religion should be used in politics. I was like, no, that's the whole problem I was trying to show in the book. So I think that the degree to which political viewpoints and faith have been collapsed in our public, maybe that's the legacy, that because I'm truly Christian, you should trust everything else I have to say, right? This sort of conflation of this authentic faith and this political authenticity have had a really corrupting effect. And I find that very dangerous versus a more sort of open acknowledgement that values are relative, that people come to these questions, serious political questions, societal questions with a variety of theological and ideological and personal ideas that influence how people make decisions and influence what needs they have. So I guess that's how I would, try to look at that. That I do think that that's in some ways the longer trajectory that I was hoping to show with the book, was this collapsing of religious authenticity with political authenticity.
Yeah. Well, it's about 6:30, so I'll just come up and say thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for coming, and please join me in thanking Dr. Davis for her talk.